This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
The most famous, I would argue, stigmatist of our day, of course, is Padre Pio. He started getting signs of the stigmata barely a month after he was ordained in 1910, but it wasn't until about 8 years later that the wounds of Christ fully appeared on both hands and both feet and in his, I guess, his side, his chest. 50 years, next 50 years, this man would bleed from those wounds on a daily basis. And my next guest, Nick Gibboni, who's going to join me here in a second, I think he said he lost a half a pint of blood a day, I think. It was something, I mean, think about how much blood that is to lose from your body and how fatiguing that must be. Yet he remained robust in his health. Most of his life, he heard confessions for hours, Satan would attack him. He'd bilocate and levitate, and, he perform all the duties that he was called to in his life. There's a book out, and I'll recommend this too. It's called The Secret Vatican Files. 2006, Pope Benedict XVI opened access to records up until the year 1939 of what had been known as the Holy Office. And that edict made it possible for an examination of the Vatican's really most fascinating inside information on a myriad of topics, including the most in-depth information on Padre Pio. It's absolutely a fascinating read. I'll broad brush some of those. It turns out that there's some real blockbusters in those once secret records. One of the things that they talk about, and one thing they said, we'll get Nick's take on a lot of this, buried in those archive of papers was documents from the Inquisitor who interviewed Padre Pio. And the documents reveal facts, phenomena, that never related to anyone. Listen to this. Pio exhibited the documents, in addition to the stigmata, right? The visions that he would have, his prophecy. He had this odor of sanctity that emanated from him, this incredible aroma, bilocation, being in two locations at once, reading souls. He had gifts of healing, prophecy, blah, 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 right? So forth. I don't want to downplay them because they're incredible preternatural gifts, right? They're amazing, right? But here's something you never hear about. He also exhibited the phenomena of hyperthermia. You're like, well, what's that? He ran temperatures so high, according to this book and these reports, they burst a thermometer. They had to resort to a horse thermometer. I'm like, are you kidding me? Father Lorenzo of San Marco, Bishop Rossi, learned that Father Lorenzo had personally witnessed Padre Pio with fevers of 109.4 degrees Fahrenheit, then 113 degrees, and then finally a mind-boggling, sizzling 118.4 degrees, way beyond what would cause fatality in any normal human being. How do you explain that? You're like, oh, there's something wrong with the thermometer, Drew. That can't be the case. Well, a man can't be in two locations at once either. He can't levitate, right? He can't have the wounds of Christ and bleed. If you can accept Pio had the wounds of Christ, why can't we accept that he had this phenomenon? I don't know why the Lord permitted it. I'm not God, but this phenomenon of hyperthermia. The normal body temperature, 98.6 degrees, 98 to 100 degrees, depending how you run. A temperature of 107 degrees for several hours could kill a healthy teenager. Pio, 118? Are you kidding me? So that was one of those fascinating little things that I thought. He didn't eat a whole lot. The investigators were pretty puzzled at how little he ate, often just a cup of hot chocolate for dinner or a glass of beer. I remember Father Seraph Mikalenko telling me that the Padre Pio would have a beer a day. I'm like, oh, it's probably a hearty one, right? Nothing the rest of the day. And yet he had a vigorous schedule. He didn't, even take dinner as nourishment at times. So the Inquisitor apparently put his finger in the wounds of Padre Pio. And they said he lost lots of blood. Let's talk about the stigmata today. You know why? And he never asked for it. Heaven chose to give this to him. And Nick will share the story of how he got it. There were those who claimed that, he was faking it, using carbolic acid in order to make the wounds appear so he could draw attention to himself. But those could never be scientifically supported. And he suffered a lot of persecution for this as well. What a powerhouse saint. I would encourage you to turn to him today. Joining me is the executive director of the National Center for Padre Pio in Bartow, Pennsylvania. They're coming out with a new documentary, too. I just did a voiceover for him on it, so we'll let you know when that ultimately gets done. I think if you find Padre Pio fascinating, you'll love the backstory to this as well. You can learn more, too, padrepio.org. Nick Gibboni joins me now. Nick, good afternoon.
Hello, Drew. How are you today?
Hey, man, I'm well. Let's talk about his stigmata. He received it on the 20th, right? Take us back in time. Describe where he was, what happened, and ultimately what he had to say about it.
Well, sure. I'm actually going to take you back a few weeks before, because it's kind of a little bit of a secret. Some people don't know. So Padre Pio is at San Giovanni Rotondo, 1918. August 5th, he's hearing confessions for boys. There was a boys' school that was located nearby, and he was hearing confessions for boys, and he had to send them away. And he said that he was visited by, he had a heavenly visitor come. He actually describes it in his own words, but it's a little bit long, so I'll just kind of summarize it for you. But a Christ-like figure appears before him. He calls it a heavenly being, and later in his life, when he was interviewed, he would confirm that it was Christ that appeared. And he said he had a weapon in his hand, something like a long, sharp-pointed steel blade, seemed to spew out fire, and this was thrust into his side. So think about Christ being pierced with a lance, and actually went into his heart. So he not only gets the stigmata mark from Christ being pierced in the side, the same type of marking, but he then experiences the spiritual gift. It's called the transverberation, which has happened to very few saints, but his heart is split in two. And he says he suffers this pain for 2 days. And so he first gets that. That's August 5th to the 7th. Then after that excruciating pain goes away, he still has the transverberation of the heart. He still has the mark, and he has the bleeding wound that's in his side from it. But then several weeks later, it's September 20th of the same year, 1918, he has said his daily mass in the morning. He goes up into the balcony loft in the back of the chapel friary to say his thanksgiving after mass. He's praying before a crucifix that you can still see that's there in San Giovanni Rotondo, and Christ appears to him again, and this time he receives the marks in his hands, in his feet, in his side. It's excruciating. It's not just that these marks appear, but he is struck almost with force. He falls down. He's bleeding profusely. No one's around. After a little while, he drags himself to his room, and it's going to be then for 50 years that he will have these marks, almost for a full 50 years, hands, feet, side, and then other manifestations will come in his body, though they're not visible all the time. He'll have the markings from where Christ is scourged, and we still have undershirts, undergarments that are marked with that scourging. And also some people will be able to see him having the crown of thorns as he says Mass, and he has a cloth there that he wipes with, and when they pick it up after Mass, it's bloody. So he's really, and he has the shoulder wound of Christ from carrying the cross, which he would later say that was his most painful to Pope John Paul II.
Well, a couple things I'm just curious about. There's a story about John Paul II. I don't know whether it's myth or whether it is reality, who apparently Padre Pio prophesied that he would be Pope one day. And also there's a story of Pope John Paul II asking Padre Pio what was his greatest wound, and he claimed it was that shoulder wound that you spoke of. What do you know about John Paul II's connection to Pio? Is it valid or not?
Sure. What I know about the connection is that we know that when Father Karol Wojtyła, of course, that was his name before Pope John Paul II, when he was he was just ordained a year, and he traveled to be with Padre Pio. He had heard of Padre Pio. So in 1947, he traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo, and we know that he spent about a week with Padre Pio. We don't know a whole lot, but a few things we do know that the Pope talked about. One was that, yes, he did reveal to him that his greatest wound, his pain, was his shoulder wound from when Christ carried the cross. And we learned this during the canonization process when the Pope revealed this. We also heard this after Padre Pio died. There was a brother friar who went to retrieve his clothing, and he saw an undershirt that had a lot of bleeding in that area. And he was, you might say, had a vision, or Padre Pio some way spoke to him that night, and he had a dream. He was in so much pain, and he said to Padre Pio, "Is this what it felt like for you?" And he basically said to him, you can only imagine, you have felt only the slightest of what I have experienced. So that's what we know about that shoulder wound. Now, the other part about whether or not Padre Pio did prophesy or predict to him that he would become Pope, We don't know it for certain. We've heard it secondhand, but we know it through an archbishop who was friends with Pope John Paul II, who said that the Pope had told him this. And what he said was that Padre Pio had told him, one day you will ascend to the highest level in the church, the highest place in the church. When Pope John Paul II became a cardinal, he thought that it had been fulfilled. He said he never imagined that he would ever become Pope.
That's wild.
So, yeah.
That's right. You know, the shoulder wound is a fascinating aspect of Pio's suffering. We all know about his hands, right? We all know about his mystical gifts. These hidden wounds are really telling because they kind of connect to other visionaries and other saints. This shoulder wound, centuries earlier, in another revelation to St. Bernard of Clairvaux, he had a vision, and our Lord appeared to him, and our Lord said that the shoulder wound carrying the heavy wooden cross caused him the greatest suffering, that it tore, into his flesh, right up to the shoulder bone. Saint Faustina, in her vision of the Passion, when she saw the Lord being flogged, and the shroud reveals to us that, there was two men that beat Christ and flogged him. One was much more aggressive than the other. There were that shoulder took unbelievable attack, and she actually saw pieces of flesh being torn off in that skirt. Very, very gruesome. So, I mean, this is something Pio never even mentioned. You think, oh gosh, your feet must hurt because you got holes in them, right? But what about the shoulder? What about his back? Now, he had to go into surgery at one point too, didn't he? And did doctors see the flagellations? Did they examine the wounds, or what happened there?
Yeah, so Padre Pio did not want to be examined. He didn't want the attention from the stigmata. He very much wanted any pain, any suffering like that Christ gave him, but he didn't want those stigmata visible because he didn't want there to be so much attention. But yes, he was examined. He actually would not take anesthesia when he went under for surgery. Yeah, but he passed out from the pain, and so once he passed out, then they examined him.
Oh, that's amazing. Grateful for all that's happening. I appreciate you being
here. Thank you, Drew.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us on.
That's Nick Gibboni. Check him out. Check out the Padre Pio Center there in Bartow, Pennsylvania. PadrePio.org is that web address. You can join me and listen on the Relevant Radio app to The Drew Mariani Show live each weekday at 2 to 5 Central. Thanks for listening.